They unified an empire, yet many were broken by the very power they wielded. The Primarchs, figures of awe and terror, faced not just external enemies, but an internal torment few could comprehend. This isn't just about their victories, it's about the immense psychological and emotional toll of leading a legion and bearing the galaxy's fate on their shoulders. In the darkness between stars, where the Astronomican's light stretches thin and the veil of reality grows gossamer, fragile, there exists a truth that the Imperium's chroniclers dare not inscribe upon their sacred data slates. It is a truth that burns in the hearts of those who stand closest to the Emperor's chosen sons, a secret whispered in the halls of fortresses that span continents and in the silent chambers where decisions are made that damn or save billions. The Primarchs were not simply generals or conquerors or even demigods walking among mortals. They were monuments to a father's ambition, living weapons forged in laboratories beneath the mountains of Terra, and each carried within their superhuman frames a burden so vast that it would have crushed any lesser being into madness or dust. But what the imperial propaganda hymns never speak of, what the devotional texts carefully omit, is that many of them were crushed regardless. The weight they bore was not merely the physical reality of command over hundreds of thousands of legionaries, nor the strategic nightmare of prosecuting wars across 1,000,000 worlds. It was something far more insidious, a poison that seeped into their transhuman minds and corroded them from within. It was the knowledge that they were made, not born, designed for purpose. Tools, however exalted, in their father's hand. Lorgar Aurelian once wrote in his private journals entries that were seized and burned during the purges that followed Monarchia's fall, that he dreamed every night of golden eyes watching him from the void, not with pride or affection, but with the cold assessment of an artificer examining a blade for flaws. He wrote that he would wake in his chambers aboard the Fidelitas Lex with his heart pounding and his hands trembling, unable to shake the feeling that he had been weighed and found wanting. This was before the word-bearers turned to the worship of the Chaos Gods, before the pilgrimage to Cadia and the pact sealed in blood and screaming. This was when Lorgar still believed in the imperial truth, still tried desperately to find meaning in a universe his father claimed was empty of divinity. The burden he carried then was the burden of purpose denied. He had been created to conquer, but his soul yearned to worship. Every city he brought into compliance felt hollow. Every world that bent knee to the Imperium's secular philosophy left him emptier than before. His legion looked to him for guidance, for meaning, and he had nothing to give them but the same emptiness that consumed him. That void, that absence of purpose, became a wound that never healed. It festered, and when the wound finally burst open on Curze Ashen Plains as perfect city burned, when he saw his greatest work reduced to rubble by his father's decree, the poison that poured out was hatred so pure it would drown half the galaxy in blood. But Lorgar's torment was not unique. It was merely one expression of a suffering that each of the Emperor's sons endured in their own way, shaped by their individual natures and the circumstances of their rediscovery. Consider Konrad Curze, the Night Haunter, whose burden was perhaps the cruelest of all. He was gifted, or cursed depending on one's perspective, with visions of the future. But these were not the useful prophecies of a sanctioned psyker or the calculated predictions of a master strategist. They were waking nightmares, fragmentary and horrifying, showing him deaths and betrayals and atrocities in vivid, inescapable detail. He saw his own murder 1,000 times before it happened, watched the scene play out with different players and different weapons, but always the same ending. His own blood on cold metal. Darkness closing in, and there was nothing he could do to prevent it. The visions drove him to the very behaviors he despised, trapping him in a loop of self-fulfilling prophecy that turned him into the monster he had foreseen becoming. His legion, the Night Lords, became extensions of his madness. They perfected the art of terror, skinning populations and hanging the corpses from block walls, broadcasting the screams of the dying across entire sectors to break resistance before it could form. Curze told himself it was necessary, that fear was the most efficient tool of compliance, that he was saving lives by making examples so horrific that others would surrender without bloodshed. But in the dark hours when he prowled the ventilation shafts of his flagship like a beast, when he carved the names of his victims into his own flesh with a combat knife, he knew the truth. He did these things because his visions showed him doing them, and he lacked the strength to choose a different path. His burden was predetermined damnation, and it broke him long before Emshun's claws finally ended his torment. The psychological weight of foresight, of knowing the shape of one's own failure, was a torture that several of the Primarchs endured. Sanguinius knew. The angel knew with absolute certainty that he would die, that he would fall at the hands of his most beloved brother, and that his death would come in the throne room of a traitor's flagship while Terra burned below. He carried this knowledge for decades, never speaking of it openly, never allowing the burden to show on his perfect features or in his luminous eyes. His sons, the Blood Angels, worshipped him with a devotion that bordered on religious fervor despite the imperial truth's prohibitions. They would have died for him without hesitation, and indeed thousands did, throwing themselves into the guns of the enemy to shield their gene, father from harm. But Sanguinius could not tell them that their sacrifices were futile, that no amount of loyalty or courage could alter what he had seen in his visions. He led them with grace and nobility, inspired them to heights of heroism that became legend. And all the while he walked toward his appointed doom, knowing that every step brought him closer to the moment when he would spread his wings one final time and face the brother who had fallen furthest into darkness. The burden of that foreknowledge was a weight that pressed down on him with every breath, making each victory taste of ashes and each triumph ring hollow. He smiled for his sons and fought with the fury of an avenging angel, but inside he was already mourning. Already dead. And what of Roboute Guilliman, who carried a different kind of burden entirely? The Lord of Ultramar was perhaps the most well-adjusted of his brothers, the most capable of seeing the Imperium not as a vehicle for personal glory or a manifestation of ideology, but as a practical construct that needed to function. He approached empire, building the way a master architect approaches a cathedral, with careful planning and attention to every detail. His Codex Astartes would become the template for space marine organization for 10,000 years, a work of such comprehensive genius that it shaped the very structure of the Imperium's military might. But Guilliman's burden was the burden of capability married to limitation. He could see how things should be done, could envision the perfect system, the optimal solution, the most efficient path forward. And then he had to watch as his brothers ignored his counsel, as the Imperium lurched from one catastrophe to another, as the grand dream his father had articulated became twisted and corrupted by incompetence and ideology and simple human weakness. He tried to build something lasting on Ultramar, a pocket of sanity in a galaxy gone mad, a working model of what the Imperium could become if it would only listen to reason. But even that was not enough. Even his 500 worlds, governed with wisdom and justice, could not hold back the tide of disorder that swept across the galaxy. When Horus betrayed the Emperor and half the legions turned traitor, Guilliman's carefully laid plans shattered like glass. He fought with the fury of a man who had seen everything he built threatened with destruction, and when the heresy ended he tried desperately to salvage what remained. But the Imperium that emerged from that civil war was not the enlightened federation he had envisioned. It was a theocratic nightmare, built on faith and fear and the systematic suppression of truth. His codex was adopted, yes, but twisted into dogma. His example became an object of worship rather than a template to improve upon. And then Fulgrim's blade opened his throat, and the poison stopped his hearts, and he slept in stasis for 10 millennia while everything he valued crumbled into dust. The peculiar agony of watching one's life's work be perverted or destroyed was not Guilliman's alone. Magnus the Red, the Crimson King of Prospero, endured perhaps the most complete annihilation of purpose that any of the Primarchs suffered. He had been created with psychic gifts that eclipsed even his father's in raw power, though not in control or wisdom. He established a legion of scholars and sorcerers, men who pursued knowledge with religious fervor and who believed that understanding the warp was the key to humanity's transcendence. The Thousand Sons became masters of their craft, able to reshape reality with thought and will, capable of feats that seemed like miracles to those who witnessed them. Magnus himself delved into lore so ancient and forbidden that it would have driven lesser minds into gibbering insanity. He conversed with entities in the Empyrean that whispered secrets of the universe's creation. He mapped currents in the warp that no human had charted before. And he convinced himself that he was in control, that his power and intellect were sufficient to protect him from the dangers he courted. His father had warned him. The Council of Nicaea had censured him, but Magnus was so certain of his own superiority, so convinced that he alone understood the true nature of the Imperium, that he ignored every warning and pressed forward into territories that should have remained unexplored. And when he discovered Horus's betrayal, when he learned that his most charismatic brother had been corrupted by the ruinous powers and was leading half the legions into rebellion, Magnus did what he thought was right. He used his power to breach the psychic wards around Terra itself, to pierce the defenses his father had erected and deliver his warning directly into the Emperor's mind. He meant to save the Imperium. Instead, he damned it. The psychic catastrophe Magnus unleashed when he shattered the wards protecting the Imperial Palace was devastating beyond measure. The Webway Project, the Emperor's secret attempt to give humanity access to a faster than light transportation network that did not rely on the warp, was irreparably damaged. Daemons poured through the breach by the thousands. The Emperor was forced to abandon the crusade and take his place upon the golden throne, not yet as the slowly dying god, corpse he would become, but as a living seal holding back an endless tide of predators from the Imperium. And it was Magnus's fault, all of it. The Emperor, furious beyond words at the destruction his son had wrought through arrogance and disobedience, dispatched Lemon Russ and the Space Wolves to Prospero with orders that remain disputed to this day. Some say the Emperor commanded Russ to bring Magnus back to Terra in chains to answer for his crimes. Others claim the order was execution. What is certain is that Russ, who had never liked the sorcerers of the 15th Legion, who saw their psychic arts as unnatural and their pursuit of knowledge as hubris, was given license to act. And he did so with devastating thoroughness. The burning of Prospero was genocide dressed in the Emperor's authority. The Space Wolves fell upon the Thousand Sons with all the fury of winter wolves hunting prey. Titska, the City of Light, burned. The Great Library, which held knowledge gathered from 1,000 worlds and 10,000 years of human history, was reduced to ash. The Thousand Sons died in their thousands, cut down by warriors who had once called them brothers. And Magnus watched it all from his pyramid, paralyzed by despair and self-recrimination. Knowing that this catastrophe was his doing, his burden had been pride, the certainty that his intellect and power made him immune to corruption. When that burden was stripped away by the consequences of his hubris, all that remained was grief so profound it opened him to the very corruption he had believed himself above. Tiench claimed him in his moment of absolute despair, and the Crimson King became the daemon Primarch, servant of the Changer of Ways. But of all the burdens the Primarchs carried, perhaps none was as intimate and excruciating as the burden of brotherhood itself. These beings had been scattered across the galaxy as infants by the machinations of the Chaos Gods, stolen from their father's laboratories and cast into the warp to be deposited on worlds where they would be shaped by circumstance rather than design. They grew up alone, each of them without peers or equals. They were orphans in the truest sense, cut off from their origins and their kin. Some, like Guilliman, were fortunate enough to be raised by loving adoptive parents who gave them stable childhoods and taught them virtue. Others, like Angron, were cast into nightmare circumstances that scarred them irreparably. But all of them grew to adulthood without knowing that they had brothers, that there were others like them scattered among the stars. When the Emperor finally found them, one by one, and revealed the truth of their origins, it must have been overwhelming. Suddenly they were not alone. Suddenly there were others who shared their nature, who possessed the same impossible strength and intelligence and will. They were given legions drawn from their own genetic material, armies of superhuman warriors who looked to them for leadership and inspiration. They were given roles in the greatest endeavor humanity had ever attempted, the great crusade to reunite the scattered worlds of mankind under one banner, and they were given each other. For beings who had known only isolation, who had stood apart from everyone around them, because of the sheer magnitude of their difference, the discovery of brotherhood must have been profoundly meaningful. The bonds that formed between certain Primarchs were deep and genuine. Horus and Sanguinius were close as true brothers could be, their affection for each other unmarred by rivalry or suspicion. Roboute Dorn and Guilliman shared a mutual respect based on their practical natures and their commitment to building rather than simply conquering. Jagatai Khan and Magnus engaged in long philosophical debates about the nature of power and the pursuit of knowledge, finding intellectual companionship in each other despite their differences. Even the more troubled Primarchs found connections. Konrad Curze and Fulgrim had been friends in their way before the corruption took hold. Mortarion and Horus shared a bond forged in the crucible of war. These relationships were precious to beings who had lived their early lives in isolation, who had never before had someone they could speak to as an equal. The idea that these bonds could be broken, that brother could turn against brother, would have been unthinkable to them in the early days of the Crusade. But break they did, and the breaking was more catastrophic than any external enemy could have inflicted. The corruption of Horus Lupercal, the brightest and most beloved of the Emperor's sons, was the fulcrum around which the entire heresy turned. He had been the War Master, chosen by the Emperor himself to lead the crusade while the Master of Mankind returned to Terra to work on projects whose nature he would not fully explain. Horus had borne that burden with pride, believing that his father's trust in him was a mark of the special bond they shared. But the responsibility of leading his brothers, many of whom were older and just as capable as he was, created tensions that Horus struggled to manage. Some, like Guilliman, questioned his decisions and offered alternative strategies. Others, like Angron, were barely controllable even under the best circumstances. The weight of command was immense, but Horus seemed equal to it. Until the moment when Erebus, first chaplain of the word-bearers and secret servant of the dark gods, arranged for Horus to be wounded by a weapon tainted with chaos. The fever that followed should have killed him. Instead, it opened him to visions carefully crafted by the ruinous powers, false futures designed to prey on his deepest fears and insecurities. He saw himself forgotten and cast aside, his achievements erased by his father's betrayal. He saw the Emperor enthroned as a god, while the Primarchs were discarded like broken tools. The visions were lies, but they were lies that resonated with doubts Horus had tried to suppress. When he woke, the poison had done its work. The War Master was no longer loyal, and with horrifying speed, he began to gather his brothers to his cause. The betrayal, when it finally came into the open at Istvan Aethu, was a wound from which the Imperium would never recover. 4 entire legions, the sons of Horus, the World Eaters, the Death Guard, and the Emperor's children, turned their weapons on loyalist elements within their own ranks, purging those who would not follow their Primarchs into damnation. The virus bombing that followed killed billions, reducing the planet's surface to a necrotic wasteland in a matter of hours. And it was only the beginning. Istvan V, where 7 legions gathered to punish the traitors, became a massacre when 4 of those legions revealed their own treachery and fell upon their brothers from behind. The Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard were butchered, their Primarchs killed or scattered. Ferrus Manus, the Gorgon, who had been one of Fulgrim's closest friends, died with his head struck from his shoulders by Fulgrim's daemonic blade. The breaking of brotherhood was complete, and the galaxy burned with civil war. The loyalist Primarchs were forced to confront a reality that shattered their understanding of the universe. The brothers they had fought beside, bled beside, shared triumphs and sorrows with, were now trying to kill them. And it was not simple rebellion, not a political disagreement that might be resolved through negotiation or compromise. This was corruption at the deepest level, a perversion of body and soul by powers that existed beyond human comprehension. The traitors were still recognizable, still wore the faces of brothers, but they had become something monstrous, something irredeemable. Sanguinius felt this betrayal more keenly than most. His friendship with Horus had been genuine and deep, one of the few relationships in his life where he felt truly understood. When the War Master's treachery was revealed, the angel's grief was profound enough that his sons could feel it through the psychic bond they shared with their gene, father. He wept openly when he learned of Ferrus's death, and his sorrow turned to cold fury as the scale of the heresy became clear. But beneath the fury was a deeper pain. The knowledge that he would have to face Horus himself, that the vision he had carried for so long would come to pass. The burden of betrayal was not just the tactical and strategic nightmare of fighting former allies who knew all the Imperium's strengths and weaknesses. It was the emotional devastation of recognizing that the bonds they had cherished were not strong enough to resist corruption. That brotherhood itself, which had seemed like one of the few genuine goods in a galaxy of horror, could be twisted into a weapon and used to destroy everything they had built together. Lemon Russ, the Wolf King of Fenris, carried guilt of a different kind. He had been the Emperor's executioner, the one sent to punish errant brothers when they stepped too far out of line. He had led the assault on Prospero, believing he was following his father's orders and doing what was necessary to protect the Imperium from Magnus's reckless sorcery. But in the years that followed, as the heresy consumed the galaxy, and it became clear that Magnus's warning, however catastrophically delivered, had been genuine, Russ began to question whether he had been manipulated. Horus had been involved in relaying the Emperor's orders, and it was entirely possible that the War Master, already corrupted but not yet openly rebellious, had altered those orders to ensure Magnus would flee to Tzeentch rather than return to Terra to face justice. The thought that he might have been used as a weapon to drive a brother into the arms of chaos, that his own nature as the Emperor's attacked dog had been turned against the very Imperium he served, was a poison that ate at Russ for the rest of his life. He fought with suicidal fury during the heresy, throwing himself and his legion into battles that should have destroyed them, as if seeking death as penance for his possible mistake. And even when the war ended and the traitors were driven into the Eye of Terror, Russ found no peace. He disappeared into the warp centuries later, seeking something he never named, and his sons still wait for his return. Jagatai Khan, the Warhawk of Chogoris, faced his own crisis of loyalty when the heresy began. His legion had operated on the fringes of the crusade, rarely interacting with the other legions or the higher command structure. The White Scars were raiders and explorers, most comfortable when they were moving fast and hitting hard, uncomfortable with the politics and pageantry that other legions seemed to thrive on. When reports of rebellion reached him, Khan was uncertain who to believe. Both sides claimed to represent the Emperor's true will. Both sides had brothers he respected among their ranks. He could have chosen either path, And for a time he weighed his options with the cool pragmatism of a warrior who had survived by trusting his instincts. What finally decided him was not ideology or loyalty to Terra, but his own nature. The forces of chaos offered him power without limit, transformation into something beyond human weakness, the ability to carve out an empire for himself and his sons. But all of it came with chains, obligations to dark gods who would own him body and soul. Khan had spent his life rejecting anyone who tried to put a leash on him, anyone who tried to tell him where he could ride and how fast he could go. The idea of bowing to the ruinous powers, of accepting their gifts and becoming their servant was fundamentally incompatible with who he was. So he remained loyal, not because he loved the Emperor more than his traitor brothers did, but because he refused to be owned by anyone or anything. His burden was the weight of a choice made for personal rather than philosophical reasons, and the knowledge that he was fighting alongside legions whose methods and beliefs he found almost as distasteful as the traitors themselves. Rogal Dorn, the Praetorian of Terra, endured a burden that was both practical and emotional. When the Emperor retreated to the Imperial Palace to hold the webway gate against the daemon incursion Magnus had unleashed, he left Dorn in command of Terra's defenses. It was Dorn's responsibility to fortify the cradle of humanity against the largest military assault in history, to hold the throne world against half the legions Astartes, and whatever forces the ruinous powers could vomit forth from the warp. He transformed Terra into a fortress, tearing down monuments and habitation blocks to create killing fields, emplacing enough weapons to crack a moon, preparing for a siege that he knew would be apocalyptic. And all the while, he had to live with the knowledge that the enemy included brothers he had fought beside, had respected, had in some cases called friends. Horus had been his war master. Perturabo had been his rival in the art of fortress craft, and their arguments about the proper balance between defense and offense had been legendary. Now both were coming to kill him, to tear down everything he had built, and there was no room for sentiment or mercy. Dorn's burden was the burden of duty carried to its ultimate extreme, the requirement that he set aside every personal feeling and become a living weapon in defense of the throne world. When the walls finally fell and the traitors broke through to the inner palace, when he stood in the ruins of his fortifications surrounded by the bodies of his sons and knew that he had failed to hold them back, the weight of that failure nearly broke him. He survived the heresy, but the man who emerged from the siege of Terra was not the same man who had fortified it. Something essential had been burned out of him in the fires of that terrible war. And then there was the question that haunted all of them, loyalist and traitor alike, in the quiet moments when the killing stopped and they were alone with their thoughts. Could they have prevented this? Was there a moment, a decision, a word spoken or unspoken, that might have changed everything? The weight of self-blame was perhaps the heaviest burden of all, because it offered no relief and no resolution. Sanguinius wondered if he could have reached Horus, could have turned him back from the abyss if he had only tried harder, spoken more eloquently, appealed to the friendship they had shared. Guilliman tortured himself with strategic assessments, identifying points where intervention might have disrupted the traitor's plans, wondering if his focus on Ultramar had blinded him to warning signs that a more attentive brother would have noticed. Dorn replayed the fortification of Terra in his mind 1,000 times, finding flaws in his designs and weaknesses in his deployments, convinced that a better defensive architect could have held the walls. The Lion, who had remained in the outer reaches of the galaxy for much of the heresy, tormented himself with the knowledge that if he had returned to Terra sooner, if he had brought the full might of the First Legion to the siege, the outcome might have been different. Every loyalist Primarch carried their own version of this guilt, their own certainty that they should have seen the warning signs, should have acted sooner or more decisively, should have somehow prevented the catastrophe that tore the Imperium apart. But the self-blame was even more acute among some of the traitors, particularly in the years immediately following their fall. Fulgrim, before the daemon wearing his skin fully consumed what remained of his original personality, experienced moments of clarity where he understood what he had become. He had been the perfectionist, obsessed with beauty and excellence, determined to prove that his small legion could achieve greatness through discipline and mastery. The Emperor's children had been his masterwork, warriors who strove for perfection in all things, who turned combat into art and conquest into poetry. And he had led them into damnation. The path had seemed so reasonable at first, the pursuit of perfection taken to its logical extreme, the exploration of sensation and experience as a way to transcend human limitation. But Slaanesh's hooks had sunk deep, and by the time Fulgrim realized what was happening, it was too late. The thing he had become, the daemon prince who wore his face and remembered his past, retained enough of Fulgrim's original personality to understand what had been lost. In those brief windows of lucidity, the self-loathing was absolute. He had betrayed everything he claimed to value. He had killed Ferrus Manus, one of the few beings in the universe he had genuinely loved, and had done it while laughing with a voice that was no longer entirely his own. The burden of that knowledge, the understanding that he had destroyed himself and damned his legion through his own weakness and pride, was a torture that even an eternity in the eye of terror could not numb. Mortarion of the Death Guard carried his own particular brand of self-hatred. He had been raised on a toxic world, taught to endure suffering as a way of life, shaped by brutality into a warrior of grim determination. When the Emperor found him, Mortarion was in the process of waging a solitary war against the necromantic overlords who ruled his world, determined to free his adopted people through sheer stubborn refusal to surrender. The Emperor had offered help, and Mortarion had accepted, but the manner of that help had left scars. The Master of Mankind had personally killed the last of the overlords, the one Mortarion had sworn to face himself, robbing him of the victory that would have proven his worth. That wound never healed. Mortarion served in the Crusade, led his legion with brutal efficiency, but he never truly accepted his father's authority. He resented the Emperor's power, the way it made everyone around him seem small and inadequate. When Horus offered an alternative, when Typhon whispered promises of strength that would let Mortarion stand as an equal rather than a servant, the Death Lord listened. And he was betrayed. Typhon, who had been corrupted by Nurgle long before Mortarion knew the Plague God's name, navigated the Death Guard fleet into a warp storm that trapped them in a nightmare of disease and decay. The Legion rotted from within, their armor fusing to their flesh, their bodies becoming factories for plagues that could kill worlds. Mortarion held out longer than any of his sons, enduring agony that would have killed any mortal being 1,000,000 times over, until finally he broke and called out to Nurgle for relief. The Plague God answered, transforming the Death Guard into his favored servants and Mortarion into a daemon prince. But the Death Lord never forgot that he had been tricked, that his rebellion had been based on lies and manipulation, that his desire for independence had been used to chain him more completely than any loyalty to the Emperor ever had. His burden was the knowledge that he had doomed his sons through his own pride, and that the freedom he sought would never be his. He belonged to Nurgle now and would for all eternity. Angron's burden was perhaps the most tragic of all because it had been forced upon him before he ever met the Emperor, before he knew he was more than a slave condemned to die for the entertainment of crowds. He had been found by slavers on his homeworld of Nuceria, beaten and brutalized and dragged to the fighting pits where he was expected to kill or be killed. The slavers had implanted the butcher's nails into his skull, archaeotech devices that murdered the parts of his brain responsible for higher thought and emotional regulation, leaving only rage and the capacity for violence. Every moment of Angron's existence was pain. The nails fired constantly, punishing him whenever he tried to think or feel anything that was not fury, rewarding him with something almost like pleasure when he killed. He was not a warrior. He was a weapon that had been lobotomized to ensure compliance, and the person he might have been was murdered long before the Emperor found him. Angron led a slave revolt, gathered an army of the broken and the damned, and fought against the high riders who had enslaved them. They made a final stand on a mountainside, knowing they would die but determined to die free. And the Emperor took Angron at that moment, teleported him away to the fleet in orbit, and left his army to be slaughtered without him. The Primarch of the 12th Legion never forgave that abandonment. He railed against his father, denounced the Imperium as just another form of tyranny, and led his legion with the same suicidal fury that the nails demanded. When Horus offered him a chance to make the Emperor suffer, Angron took it without hesitation. But even in rebellion, there was no freedom. The nails never stopped. The pain never ended. His transformation into a daemon prince of Khorne only made it worse, locking him forever into the mindless butchery that the Archaeotech had begun. His burden was existence itself, an unending torment that he could neither escape nor endure with anything resembling sanity. And the true tragedy was that it had never been his choice. Not the nails, not the abandonment, not the damnation. He was the only one of the Primarchs who had been destroyed before he was found, and everything that came after was just the slow motion collapse of a being who should have been allowed to die with honor on that mountainside. The weight of failure, the crushing knowledge that they had not only lost, but had inflicted that loss on the galaxy through their own actions or inaction, was the final burden that every Primarch carried into whatever fate awaited them. For the Loyalists, it was the burden of victory without triumph. They had won the heresy in the sense that Terra still stood and the Emperor remained, if only technically, alive. But the cost had been catastrophic. Half the legions were gone, turned traitor and driven into the Eye of Terror, where they would continue to raid and pillage for 10,000 years. The Emperor was entombed on the Golden Throne, his physical form slowly dying while his consciousness held shut the rift into the webway and served as the beacon for the Astronomicon. He could no longer speak, could no longer guide his Imperium, could no longer be the father they had known. The dream of secular enlightenment, of a human-dominated galaxy free from superstition and fear, died with him. The Imperium that emerged from the heresy was a theocratic monstrosity that would have horrified the Emperor of the Great Crusade, a dystopian nightmare of religious mania and bureaucratic incompetence that ground up billions of human lives every day in the machinery of its own perpetuation. The Loyalist Primarchs tried to hold it together, tried to implement reforms, and maintain some semblance of the original vision, but they were fighting a losing battle. One by one, they disappeared. Guilliman was poisoned and placed in stasis. The lion vanished into the rock, hidden even from his own legion. Russ went into the eye searching for redemption or death. Vulcan pursued his scattered artifacts across the galaxy, appearing and disappearing according to a pattern only he understood. Jagatai Khan rode into the webway and never returned. Dorn led a crusade that killed him, or seemed to, leaving only his hand recovered from the battlefield. Korax fled into the eye to hunt the traitors, becoming a monster himself in the darkness. Only one remained active, one who should have died, but was denied even that mercy, impaled on a throne of his own and forced to watch as the Imperium forgot everything he had tried to teach it. And 10,000 years later, when Guilliman finally woke from his stasis, when he broke free and looked upon what the Imperium had become, the horror and despair he felt were complete. This was the legacy. This was what they had fought for. This was what all the sacrifices and victories and brotherhood had purchased. A dying empire sustained by faith and fear and the blood of its own children. For the traitors, the burden of failure was even more complete because they had lost in every way that mattered. They had rebelled against what they saw as the Emperor's tyranny, had sought freedom or power or meaning outside his vision, and they had been cast down, broken, scattered into the eye of terror where time moved strangely and reality obeyed no laws they could rely on. They had become the slaves of the very powers they had thought to use for their own purposes. Horus himself was obliterated, his soul destroyed utterly by the Emperor in the final confrontation aboard the vengeful Spirit, leaving nothing behind but the memory of what he had been. The other traitor Primarch survived, if their existences could be called survival. Fulgrim was a prisoner in his own body, his consciousness subsumed by the daemon that wore his shape. Perturabo retreated to Midrengard and surrounded himself with fortifications, building an impregnable fortress where he could rage against the futility of everything he had tried to create. Lorgar vanished into the eye, meditating on the nature of the gods he had sworn himself to, seeking meaning in their madness and finding only further layers of corruption that infected everything they touched. Magnus brooded in his tower on the planet of the sorcerers, commanding his rubric Marines who were nothing more than animated armor filled with dust, the ghosts of the sons he had failed to save from the mutations his own hubris had inflicted upon them. Mortarion waged his eternal war against the Imperium from the plague gardens of the scourged stars, spreading disease and death, but finding no satisfaction in the victory that Nurgle had promised him. Angron rampaged through the Imperium, a mindless beast of rage who retained nothing of the leader he had once been, summoned occasionally to real space to butcher and destroy before the effort of maintaining his manifestation became too great and he was dragged back into the warp. And Curze was dead, murdered by an assassin exactly as he had foreseen, his final words a vindication that rang hollow because proving his visions correct meant accepting that he had never been anything more than their puppet. The legacy they left behind was measured in ashes and unmarked graves, in worlds burned and populations exterminated, in the slow degradation of the Imperium from an enlightened federation into a totalitarian theocracy that would have been unrecognizable to the architects of the Great Crusade. Their father's dream was dead. The Astronomicon still burned, yes, guiding ships through the warp and holding back the darkness, but it was fueled by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers whose souls were consumed to maintain the beacon. The Golden Throne was a prison and a life support system combined, trapping the Emperor in a half-life where he could neither act nor die, where he existed in perpetual agony as his body slowly decayed while his mind fought battles in dimensions that mortals could not perceive. Some among the Imperium's countless trillions whispered prayers, claiming he was ascending, that his spirit was fragmenting and spreading across the galaxy to manifest in moments of miracle and intervention, that he was becoming the god he had always denied being. But these were just the desperate hopes of people who needed to believe their suffering had meaning, that the mountains of corpses and the oceans of blood were purchasing something more than simple survival. The truth, if truth existed anymore in a galaxy where belief could reshape reality, was that the Emperor was dying, had been dying for 10,000 years. And when he finally expired, if the mechanisms of the Golden Throne ever failed, the psychic shock would tear a rift in reality that would make the Eye of Terror look like a minor spatial anomaly. Terror itself would become a daemon world, and the Astronomicon would go dark, stranding every human world in isolation as warp travel became impossible. The Imperium would not fall quickly. It would die slowly, world by world, as each isolated system ran out of resources and succumbed to whatever predators happened to be nearby. This was the true burden of being a Primarch's burden. Not the weight of command or the responsibility of leading a legion, though those were heavy enough. Not the tactical challenges of conducting warfare on a galactic scale, though those were complex beyond mortal comprehension. The real burden was the knowledge of what they had been made for, what their father had invested in them, what potential they had represented, and how completely they had failed to live up to it. They were supposed to be the instruments of humanity's transcendence, the shepherds who would guide the species through the darkness of old night and into a golden age where ignorance and superstition were conquered by reason and science. They were supposed to work together, each contributing their unique gifts and perspectives, creating something greater than the sum of their parts. They were supposed to love each other as brothers, united by purpose and blood, incapable of the petty rivalries and destructive competitions that had characterized human leadership throughout history. And instead, they had fractured, betrayed, murdered each other, burned the galaxy, killed their father, or came close enough that the distinction was meaningless. Everything they touched turned to poison. Every victory was hollow because of what it cost. Every moment of triumph was overshadowed by the knowledge that their brothers on the other side of the war were experiencing defeat, and that both triumph and defeat were ultimately meaningless because the war itself should never have happened. The Primarchs were not given the luxury of normal grief or processing of trauma. They were transhuman, their minds designed to operate at levels far beyond baseline human cognition, their emotional responses carefully engineered to support their roles as military commanders and civilization builders. But that engineering had limits. It could not account for the specific horror of fratricide on a cosmic scale. It could not prepare them for the psychological devastation of watching their father, the only being in the universe who had been their superior, reduced to a corpse on a throne. It could not help them cope with the guilt of leading their sons, men who trusted them absolutely, into damnation or death. The transhuman architecture of their minds meant that they could not simply break down and collapse the way a normal human might under such stress. They had to continue functioning, continue leading, continue making decisions that affected billions of lives, all while carrying wounds that would never heal. Some of them internalized the pain and let it drive them to greater extremes of behavior. Dorn became even more rigid and inflexible, transforming the Imperial fists into a legion defined by pain and sacrifice. Korax retreated into guilt and shadow, his legion becoming specialists in stealth and striking from darkness because their Primarch could no longer bear to be seen. Guilliman tried to fix everything, working himself to exhaustion to implement systems and structures that might preserve some fragment of the original dream. Even though he knew it was futile, others externalized their suffering and turned it into weapons. The traitor Primarchs embraced their corruption, leaning into the transformation because accepting it was easier than fighting a battle they had already lost. But perhaps the most profound burden was the one that none of them could escape and few of them acknowledged openly. They had been made, designed, constructed in laboratories beneath the mountains of Terra using genetic science and warp craft that merged the material and immaterial in ways that violated every natural law. They were not human, despite their superficial resemblance to the species they led. They were post-human, transhuman, something fundamentally different that had been built to serve a specific purpose in a grand design they were never fully informed about. And that meant they were not free. They had never been free. Their father had created them as tools, as weapons, as instruments of his will. He had scattered them across the galaxy and allowed them to be shaped by their adoptive worlds. Yes, but even that might have been part of his plan. Some of the Primarchs suspected that the Emperor had foreseen their scattering, or had even orchestrated it, using the Chaos God's theft as a way to give his creations the diverse experiences and perspectives they would need to lead in different contexts. Whether that was true or paranoid fantasy, it hardly mattered. The fact remained that they existed because he wanted them to exist, for purposes he defined, and when they deviated from those purposes, he disposed of them or neutralized them without apparent remorse. Magnus had been condemned for trying to warn his father of Horus's treachery. Angron had been left to lead a legion, while the butcher's nails slowly destroyed his mind. even though the Emperor certainly had the technology to remove the devices if he had chosen to do so. Lorgar had been punished for worshipping his father, for seeing divinity in the Emperor's power, even though the Emperor was demonstrably more than human and the distinction between godhood and supreme psychic mastery was largely semantic. The burden of being a created thing, of knowing that your existence serves someone else's purpose rather than being an end in itself, is a special kind of existential horror. It means that your thoughts and feelings and desires, no matter how genuine they feel, might simply be expressions of your programming. It means that your proudest achievements might just be you fulfilling your designated function, no more meaningful than a servitor successfully performing its assigned task. It means that your capacity for growth and change is limited by the parameters your creator established, and any rebellion against those parameters is still taking place within a framework you did not choose and cannot fully escape. Some of the Primarchs seemed unbothered by this, or at least did not let it show. Rogal Dorn embraced his role as the Emperor's Praetorian without apparent internal conflict, finding meaning in perfect execution of duty. Lemon Russ took pride in being the Emperor's executioner, seeing his brutal nature as a gift rather than a limitation. But others chafed against the constraints of their creation. Konrad Curze's entire tragic arc can be read as a desperate attempt to prove that he had agency, that his choices mattered, even as his visions showed him that his future was fixed and unavoidable. Angron's rage was partly directed at his father for refusing to remove the nails, for allowing him to remain a broken weapon rather than becoming a complete being. Magnus's pursuit of forbidden knowledge was an attempt to transcend the limitations his father had supposedly placed on psychic research, to prove that he could surpass his creator's wisdom. And Horus, who had been the favorite, the brightest and most beloved, who had been chosen as War Master and entrusted with leading the Great Crusade, whose fall was the hinge on which the entire galaxy's fate turned. What was his burden? The visions he experienced on Davin, whether they were true or false or some poisonous mixture of both, showed him a future where the Emperor became a god, and the Primarchs were forgotten, where all their achievements were attributed to the Master of mankind alone, where they were erased from history or remembered only as footnotes to their father's glory. For a being who had been created to lead, who had been designed with charisma and tactical genius and the ability to inspire absolute loyalty, the prospect of being discarded was perhaps the most unbearable thing imaginable. It struck at the core of his purpose. If he was not needed, if his father could achieve the goals of the Imperium without him, then what was he? Just a tool that had outlived its usefulness, to be put away in storage while the Emperor moved on to the next phase of his grand plan. The tragedy was that Horus did not realize, or chose not to believe, that the visions were showing him one possible future that would only come to pass if he rebelled. The Imperium's transformation into a theocratic dystopia happened because the heresy forced the Emperor onto the Golden Throne and created a power vacuum that the ecclesiarchy filled. The deification of the Emperor was a direct result of his near martyrdom during the Siege of Terra, not something that would have occurred if Horus had remained loyal. But by the time Horus stood in the throne room of the vengeful spirit and faced his father for the final time, such distinctions were meaningless. He had been corrupted so thoroughly by the ruinous powers that whatever he had been, whatever nobility or virtue he had possessed, was gone. The thing wearing his face was a puppet dancing to the dark god's tune, and when the Emperor finally struck him down with enough psychic force to obliterate his soul, it was a mercy as much as a punishment. The question that haunts the scattered records of the heresy, the question that scholars and theologians and military historians have debated for 10 millennia, is whether any of it could have been prevented. If the Emperor had been a better father, less distant and cold, more willing to explain his plans and trust his sons with the full truth of his vision, would they have remained loyal? if he had taken the time to understand their individual natures and needs rather than treating them as interchangeable weapons to be deployed as circumstances required. Could he have addressed the wounds and insecurities that the Chaos Gods exploited? If he had removed the butcher's nails from Angron's skull, or prevented Magnus from delving into the most dangerous corners of warp, lore, or shown Lorgar a way to find meaning that did not require divine worship, would the heresy have happened at all? Or was it inevitable from the moment the Primarchs were scattered, the moment the Chaos Gods touched the Emperor's greatest works and infected them with the seeds of their own destruction? The answer, like so much else in the grim darkness of the far future, is unknowable. The Imperium does not keep accurate historical records. The truth about the heresy has been buried under 10,000 years of propaganda and revisionist theology and simple institutional incompetence. Whole legions have been stricken from the records, their names forbidden to speak, their heraldry destroyed, their very existence denied. The Primarchs themselves have become mythological figures, their actual personalities and motivations lost beneath layers of hagiography and demonization. The Loyalists are remembered as saints and heroes whose every action was righteous and whose motives were pure. The traitors are remembered as monsters who were always corrupt, who were born wrong, who betrayed the Imperium out of malice rather than pain or desperation or tragic misunderstanding. But the burden remains. It echoes through the centuries in the gene, seed that the Space Marine chapters carry, passed down from the original legions, bearing the psychic imprint of their Primarch's trauma. The Blood Angels carry the red thirst and the black rage, curses born from Sanguinius's suffering and death, that transform their greatest warriors into mindless berserkers who relive their gene, father's final moments over and over. The Dark Angels hunt the fallen with obsessive secrecy, trying to atone for their Primarch's failure to prevent a schism in his legion, unable to acknowledge their shame openly because the lion taught them that appearances matter more than truth. The Space Wolves remember Russ's guilt over Prospero, though they would never name it as such, and it manifests in their mistrust of psychers and their aggressive rejection of anything they perceive as sorcery. The Imperial Fists practice the pain glove and pursue suffering as a sacrament, echoing Dorn's inability to process emotion in any way that was not connected to physical sensation and endurance. Every chapter bears scars that trace back to their Primarch's unresolved trauma, carrying forward patterns of behavior and belief that no longer serve any useful purpose but cannot be abandoned because they are woven into the chapter's identity. And the traitor legions, warped by millennia in the Eye of Terror, have become caricatures of their original flaws. The World Eaters can no longer do anything but kill because Angron's rage has been encoded into their gene, seed and amplified by the nails that many of them now implant voluntarily. The Thousand Sons are dust and armor, their bodies destroyed by mutations they could not control, their souls bound to a Primarch who still does not understand that knowledge without wisdom is just another form of ignorance. The Death Guard spread Nurgle's plagues with grim determination, unable to acknowledge that they are perpetuating the very cycles of suffering and decay that Mortarion originally rebelled against. And what of those who still live, who have not died or been lost or transformed into daemon princes? Guilliman walks among the Imperium in the closing years of the 41st millennium, resurrected by the Unari and now serving as Lord Commander, trying desperately to reform an institution so calcified and corrupt that meaningful change is almost impossible. He looks upon the Imperium Nihilus, the half of the galaxy cut off from the Astronomicon by the Great Rift, and sees his father's dream dying in real time. He walks the halls of the Imperial Palace and sees his gene, sons worshipping him as a demigod, despite his furious insistence that he is just a man, a weapon, a tool doing the job he was made for. He reads reports of atrocities committed in the Emperor's name, of populations exterminated for the crime of mutation or deviation from approved doctrine, of resources squandered by bureaucratic incompetence and interdepartmental rivalry. He attends councils where religious fanatics argue theology, while the Imperium burns, where admirals and generals sacrifice millions of soldiers in pointless wars of pride and dogma, where the machinery of governance grinds on, with no one at the wheel who understands or cares about the original purpose of the Imperium. And he continues working, continues trying to fix the unfixable, continues bearing the burden that destroyed him once already and will destroy him again if he allows it to. Because what else can he do? He is a Primarch. He was made to serve, to lead, to carry weights that would crush any lesser being. And even knowing that the weight will destroy him, even seeing clearly that he is fighting a battle he cannot win, he cannot bring himself to lay it down. Somewhere in the rock, the lion may still sleep, hidden in stasis or meditation or some state between life and death, waiting for a moment that may never come or may already have passed. Somewhere in the eye of terror, Russ might still be hunting, transformed into something that is no longer entirely Liman Russ, but retains enough of his original purpose to continue the chase. Vulcan appears and disappears according to patterns only he understands, pursuing a quest whose completion conditions were set before the heresy and may no longer be relevant. Khan might be alive in the webway, or dead, or lost in the same time, distorted hell that has claimed so many others who ventured into that ancient network. Korak stalks traitor worlds in the eye, a shadow wearing a Primarch shape, murdering his corrupted brother's sons with methodical precision. The loyalist Primarchs who survive, in whatever form they survive, are still carrying the burden, still trying to fulfill purposes that were assigned to them by a father who may or may not have understood what he was asking of them. Still haunted by the brothers they lost, the futures they failed to secure, the dreams that died in fire and betrayal. And the traitor Primarchs, damned to an eternity of service to gods who care nothing for them beyond their utility, carry their own burdens. They remember what they were before the corruption took hold. They remember brotherhood, even if they have convinced themselves they never valued it. They remember purposes they chose for themselves, even if those purposes were foolish or destructive. They remember a time when they were more than weapons or slaves or monsters, when they had agency and hope and the possibility of becoming something greater than what they were made to be. And they know, though they would never admit it even to themselves, that they traded all of that for promises that were lies from the beginning. Power without freedom is not power at all. Knowledge without sanity is not knowledge. Perfection pursued to the point of corruption is not perfection. Endurance purchased at the cost of feeling is not life. They damned themselves and their sons for goals that were revealed to be traps, and there is no escape. No redemption, no end to the suffering except the oblivion that none of them can quite bring themselves to seek. This is what it means to be a Primarch's burden. It is not glorious. It is not the inspiring narrative of heroes sacrificing for a greater good. It is the story of beings who were created to be more than human, but were not given the emotional architecture to survive what that meant. Who were granted impossible power and crushing responsibility without the wisdom to navigate the contradictions inherent in both. Who were thrown into a universe where the fundamental laws of reality could be rewritten by belief and emotion, where gods existed that fed on suffering and had been manipulating human history for eons before the Emperor ever began his grand project. They were expected to be perfect, to be incorruptible, to love each other as brothers, while competing for their father's approval and prosecuting wars where the moral lines were never as clear as the propaganda claimed. They were expected to bear the weight of the galaxy on their shoulders and never complain, never falter, never acknowledge the cost of what they were doing. And when they broke, when they fell or failed, or simply could not carry the weight anymore, they were discarded, erased, forgotten or transformed into cautionary tales that served the Imperium's political needs rather than historical truth. The burden remains because the Imperium remains, a vast and dying empire held together by faith and fear and the inertia of its own bureaucracy, consuming itself slowly as it struggles to survive against enemies that vastly outnumber it. The burden remains in every space marine who looks up at the stars and wonders whether their Primarch is still out there somewhere, watching, judging, preparing to return when the hour is darkest. The burden remains in every imperial citizen who prays to the god, emperor for deliverance, not knowing that the being they worship would have despised their worship if he were still capable of despising anything. The burden remains in the structure of the Imperium itself, its rigid hierarchies and its resistance to change. Its determination to repeat the same mistakes forever because acknowledging that the mistakes would require admitting that the Primarchs and the Emperor himself were fallible. The burden remains in the traitor legions that still raid from the Eye of Terror, still trying to finish what Horus started, still believing that if they can just topple the Imperium and desecrate the corpse on the Golden Throne, they will finally be free of the chains they forged for themselves 10,000 years ago. And perhaps that is the final, most crushing burden of all, the knowledge that even death does not bring release. Horus was obliterated, his soul destroyed so completely that not even the Chaos Gods could reassemble the fragments, and yet his name still echoes through the galaxy as the arch-traitor, the first and greatest of the fallen. Sanguinius died on the vengeful spirit. His body returned to Baal, where his sons still mourn him. But his suffering lives on in every blood angel who succumbs to the black rage and experiences their Primarch's death as if it were their own. Ferus Magnus was beheaded on Istvan V, but his legion still exists in fragmentary successor chapters that define themselves by his absence, by the hole he left that can never be filled. The Primarchs who died have not been allowed to rest because they are too useful as symbols, as rallying points, as examples of virtue or cautionary tales of corruption, and the ones who still live cannot rest because they are still needed, still expected to lead and fight and sacrifice, still bearing burdens that should have been distributed among thousands but which fell to them because they were made to be more than human and therefore were expected to endure more than any human could. The galaxy does not care about their suffering. The universe is vast and cold and empty of inherent meaning, and the small dramas of created beings trying to fulfill or escape their designated purposes are less than dust in the cosmic scale. But that does not make the burden any lighter. That does not make the pain any less real. The Primarchs were given the strength to carry the weight of worlds, but they were never given the option to refuse the weight. They were made to serve, and serve they did, and serve they continue to do, either loyally or in rebellion, but always serving, always bearing, always crushed beneath the expectations and responsibilities and guilt and grief that defined their existences from the moment they became aware of what they were. This is their legacy. This is their gift and their curse. To be powerful beyond measure and helpless in the ways that matter most. To be fathers to legions and orphans in the universe. To be symbols of humanity's potential and victims of its most fundamental flaw. The belief that any burden can be borne if the one carrying it is simply strong enough. They were strong enough to conquer a galaxy, but they were not strong enough to remain unbroken by the cost of that conquest, and the cracks that formed in their souls became the fissures through which the Imperium's golden age drained away, leaving behind only the long, slow decline into an ending that never quite arrives but is always approaching. This is what it means to be a Primarch's burden, and it is a weight that will never be set down as long as the Imperium endures, and the memory of what they were, what they might have been, continues to haunt the darkness between the stars.